everyone. Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters. With your questers, Josh and Dan, I am Dan.
And I am Josh.
Take two is much better, Josh. On today's podcast, we'll be discussing all things historical, as we're going to talk about the foundation of the Western Kingdoms from the Elven Nations book. So for all of you who've been waiting 215 odd episodes for us to get to this, you can finally exhale. We are getting to this. You're welcome.
See, the first time that we recorded this intro, Dan was not actually recording and tried to make me snarf my drink with that same joke. Not as effective when I knew it was coming.
Exactly, and he knew it was coming. He still drank at the same time, though, just in case I could get him to do it twice.
Just to prove a point.
Because we can. Anyway, if you have any questions for us about anything you've ever heard, anything you want to talk about, or anything you're going to hear tonight on this episode, by all means, drop us a line at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Josh, initial thoughts on the Western Kingdoms when you came across it in this book? I know you were not editing the book at that time, but...
No, as I had mentioned, the story of the development of the Elven Nations book was a rocky one.
Yes.
The original plan was to take the manuscript that was worked up for 3rd edition, figuring, much like the Travar book, oh, great, this is something that already exists. We can polish it up, get it out as one of the book's stretch goals in that initial Kickstarter before we get to Questors, which was like the first wholly, what was at that time felt like wholly original writing from scratch book.
4th edition, yeah.
It became evident for various reasons, none of which are bad, but that we were not really going to be able to use the original manuscript that was planned.
Yeah.
And so that was where we had brought on Kyle, Michael, and Carl, who up to that point had really just been working on the early Legends of Barsave stuff, to come in and basically, we're going to need an Elven Nations book turned around about as quickly as you can, because we're already kind of behind the 8 ball on the whole thing. So here, have fun. So a lot of the stuff in Shosara and the Western Kingdoms that is like original to those areas and not something sort of pulled from the Bloodwood related info was all them. And because I was familiar with the original material, I stepped back so that my knowledge of that stuff would not influence what they were working on. So my involvement in that book was pretty minimal. That said, I do like what has sort of been come up with here as far as the Western Kingdoms go. I know we've talked about that the Western Kingdoms were kind of ill-defined previously and never particularly placed. Lou has mentioned that the original thought was that the Western Kingdoms that are referred to there were the Earthdawn British Isles.
Yeah.
All the way off to the far west of the landmass. Although the Theron Empire book did place Sereatha in the place where we have it here in this book, on the shores of the Baltic Sea, present day Latvia, Estonia, that area.
Yeah.
And I think that it may not have been originally intended that Sereatha was part of the Western Kingdoms, but I think it's understandable that that connection could be made because it had been so sort of ill-defined before. And so with Sereatha placed there and connecting it with the idea of the Western Kingdoms, that kind of puts it in that spot between Barsave to its east and Vasgothia to the west of it, which means that a big chunk of that area ends up getting attached to the wastes in order to actually give it any space to do anything. And so what needed to be developed was how the Western Kingdoms connect to the wastes and providing a little bit of information on that blighted area on Barsave's western border.
Agreed, because it's the squishy middle, essentially, on the map. It's the squishy middle between Iopos and Vasgothia. That's where the wastes are. Just slightly north of that is where the Western Kingdoms are, and then just to the northeast. So basically, the Western Kingdoms is a large region northwest of Barsave and Iopos specifically. that further part just off the Barsafe map, and southwest of Shosara. So just kind of do your thing there on the map. That's how to kind of
There's
get
a
this.
big chunk of like not really settled / developed area between the Western Kingdoms and Shosara.
Mm-hmm.
Enough sort of undeveloped space between them so that they are very clearly like separate entities. There was contact and trade between them, but they're not like butting up right against each other.
Yeah. They're close enough they can be, kissing cousins, but not necessarily on top of each other.
And Shosara is something of a city-state, and while it does have some territory within its sphere of influence, the vast majority of the population is just there on that peninsula.
Yeah.
Again, not looking at nations in the way that we think of them today.
Yeah. So following the line of the essay about the founding of the Western Kingdoms, let's break this down just kind of so everyone can get a picture in their mind. There are individual kingdoms known as gerryth that are typically ruled by one ranelle, elven ranelle, because most of this, again, elven nations, we're going to talk about elves. So the gerryth are somewhat hierarchical or at least aligned based upon size. A smaller Gwyneth Paltrow? No. A small gerryth may align to a larger one, creating a web of loyalty and obligations. It's all very political and fief-ish and Game of Thrones type, trading, bartering, favors.
Very like more traditional feudalist political organization. Talked about as like kingdoms, but again, each kingdom is more or less like a city-state kind of thing.
Yeah.
With the seat of a particular ranelle and then the communities around it that it sort of has control over, and then some other areas where you have lesser settlements or communities that pledge themselves to the more powerful ones.
Yeah.
It's not quite to the degree that, say, what we think of as the classic Middle Ages feudalist society.
Yeah.
Is,
one English castle,
but it does have that kind
around
of
them and
political network involved.
Totally. So like one English castle, all the lands around them, they're responsible for. That's their lord, so forth and so on. But if you get enough of these gerryth together, and they unify a little bit, they actually form what in the Elven Nations book calls a Gwydenro, which in Elvish means heartland. And so every kingdom in the Western Kingdoms eventually owes fealty to Sereatha. So this all is a big whole pyramid. I can't say scheme, but it's a big pyramid construction type where you have many, many gerryth out there as just little kingdoms and all the lands and the fiefs that go along with them. All go to sort of a Gwydenro, which is 3 or 4 of them have combined to form a network of alliances. But ultimately speaking, if Sereatha, pulls the trigger and says, hey, we need everybody to come fight, guess what? There you are.
Yeah, Sereatha is the capital and is not, strictly speaking, under the control of any individual ranelle the way that other kingdoms are.
Yeah, we'll get to Sereatha here like right now. So breaking all that down. So just so you understand how the kingdoms work on the whole as a large 30,000 foot view picture. Now we're going to encapsulate a little bit closer on. So Sereatha, and we'll get to this in detail later on, suffered greatly during the Scourge. But then again, who didn't? Well, Shosara, I think, was the only one who didn't suffer greatly during the Scourge. There are 5 consortes who lead the city of Sereatha, one of those acting as the High Steward, person in charge, the person who speaks on their behalf. So you've got one vocal component, and only a member of the Western Kingdom ranelles may officially rule a kingdom in the Western Kingdoms. If any of that made sense, let me know.
It did. It is very elfy.
Yes, very, very elfy.
You need to be a member of an elf noble family in order to be in charge of one of the fiefdoms that are part of the overall Western Kingdoms.
Yeah, totally. And usually that is determined by birth. It doesn't go into more detail about that. So it could be eldest. It could be, I don't know. Knock yourself out with whatever that means to you.
It's probably traditional that the leader of a particular ranelle is one of the senior members of the family in terms of age.
Yeah.
But I imagine that different ranelles may handle some aspects of that leadership in slightly different ways.
Agreed. Fair enough. So the founding ranelles, there are 3. And we said that there are 5 consortis who run Sereatha, but there are 3 founding ranelles. We'll get to the other 2 components in a minute. There's the Escalanus, the Fensalor, and the Trisrora. Now, if the Escalanus rings a bell, it should. We did a whole episode on them a little while ago. In fact, episode 197. Haha, details. If it doesn't ring a bell offhand, Kethos Escalanus is the person who created the ritual of thorns, to ring your memory on that one. So the Escalanus in the whole milieu of the founding of Sereatha, the Escalanus brought the enlightenment of the wheel, the Fensalor brought martial knowledge and force of arms, and the Trisrora brought learning and understanding from every society that they had ever encountered before this. So, they all brought something to the party.
Yeah. Now, there is a little bit of a nod to this is not where the elves came from.
Agreed.
Talks about the Escalanus having come from the west, from the setting sun. They had traveled there from elsewhere and settled there on the shores.
Yeah, they crossed the sea.
We're still looking at the true origins of these things being somewhat murky in the mists of the distant past.
Of course. Yeah, so the Escalanus traveled here. Most of them set up shop here, and some continued on later on, which we will get to. My favorite part of this entire essay on the meeting is when the Escalanus made landfall, their family split to find the truths that had brought them across the Budvir to the shores of the Bay Turnvir. A lot of veers. While many moved inland, others stayed behind and began construction on a permanent home. Before long, an army of Fensalor arrived and challenged the Escalanus. The Fensalor claimed the coast was under their protection, and only those born within sight of the sea could remain. The Escalanus refused to leave, arguing that all intelligent life should work together and seek the world's greater truths. The Fensalor remained unmoved. As the Fensalor prepared to push the Escalanus into the sea, the Trisrora made their appearance. The Trisrora were shocked to find elves on the shore of the Budvir and were compelled to intervene. The Trisrora spoke of the other cultures and name-givers they had discovered throughout the land. They spoke of Tiskrang and dwarves. They spoke of the exotic and distant east. They shared their journals and legends and pointed out the rarity of elves. With this evidence of kinship, the Fensalor were calmed, and the 3 families sought to work in harmony. Together, the 3 developed a plan for a city to be built near the shore, high atop the hills. The Trisrora would see to the city's infrastructure, the Fensalor would see to the city's defense, and the Escalanus would see to the city's enlightenment. This city would grow to become Sereatha, the city of spires. That's my favorite part, because it really does encapsulate everything. It led to everybody's strengths as far as those ranelles were concerned, and just...
It's the distant past. It's kind of legendary. Here is the story that we tell about how we came to be.
Yes.
Hey, look, the 3 families that are in the most, that are like at the top of
prominent positions
of the heap in this culture are the ones that feature in our founding legends. How about that?
The winners tell...
Like so many other things, especially when it comes to Elven history, there is potentially a lot going on beneath the surface.
Yes.
In terms of like the actual events and reasons behind them and things like that.
Yeah. So history is written by the winners and their egos. I see this.
To a certain extent, yeah.
Especially in Elven. So together they did found Sereatha, and eventually the wayward Escalanus who pushed on went to go down to Wyrm Wood. I forget if they helped found Wyrm Wood or if it was just they were incorporated into Wyrm Wood.
The Escalanus are one of the oldest ranelles in Wyrm Wood, yes.
I've been reading too much on elves and my memory is a little muddy. That's on me. So all 3 ranelles swore fealty to Sereatha first, and that's a good thing. They created a court to mirror Wyrm Wood, and this is during the reign of Queen Meliora, which predates Queen Phyla and Queen Delia and everybody else. And
this is way long ago.
Yeah, very, very long ago. So we're not going to have a lot of information on this one. Meliora, seeing exactly what Sereatha was about, appointed Harwin, the first high steward, and sent to Sereatha 100 of her best soldiers and 101 of her best artisans from the wood to Sereatha to live and reside and help them build the city. So the two other consortes that help run Sereatha, we have one of each of the ranelles, the Escalanus, the Fencelor, and the Trisora. They then went on to appoint one of the Knights of the Crimson Spire. They went on to appoint one of the Knights of the Crimson Spire, which is, of course, the soldiers that Queen Meliora sent over, and one of the Order of the Amethyst Spire, which is one of the artisans that Queen Meliora sent over. Both are still here serving Sereatha, and both of these spires actually helped Sereatha survive the Scourge. So there are your 5 consortes: Escalanus, Fencelor, Trisora, one of the Crimson Spire, and one of the Amethyst Spire.
Again, this is the history as told by...
Yes.
If we're talking about the time of Queen Meliora, we're talking about centuries and centuries ago.
Eons.
Plenty of time for whatever story that certain individuals would want to tell or have known about their past in order to justify the way that things are. Because remember, while there aren't a lot of them, there are immortal elves that are in among the wood, in among Sereatha, in among Shosara, in among Thera, that are all this kind of like interplay of family squabbles and relationships and whatnot, and their desires in the wake of the even more distant past, and how they kind of want to be in charge of things and establishing themselves and guiding the early days of these communities and kind of putting them together and developing the stories and legends that get told around their distant past in order to justify this is the way that things are.
Yeah.
The story presented here in Sereatha is like, yes, we were here first, and then we discovered the queen, and the queen was wonderful, and she was the epitome of elvendom, so we swore allegiance to her.
Yeah.
But that happened like 2,000 years ago.
So a lot of the details...
However long ago it was.
Yeah.
Much like the founding myth of the elves in Bloodwood, it goes far enough back that we don't really have dates on any of this stuff. It just kind of like happened long ago, and there is this idea of this continuous elven culture, this ancient, long-lived epitome of grace and culture and knowledge and learning, and this is the way that things are, and we're in charge, and here is why. But, of course, in Sereatha, anyone who wishes to take part in the power structures that we have built around this community is able to succeed and maybe even
partake.
The lowest can, if they demonstrate their worth and value, can rise to the stations above, you know, in all of the classic typical those in power saying, oh, yes, it is a meritocracy. Obviously, I deserve to be in charge or I wouldn't be in charge. And you, if you could demonstrate that you are worthy enough, maybe someday you could be in charge as well. This is a lie that people in power have been telling to people not in power since, like, the foundations of civilization.
Yes.
This is nothing new. This is just people with pointy ears doing the telling.
All you Calvinists out there, yes.
Again, take this history of the Elven Nation, of the Western Kingdoms and its founding and why things are the way that they are, with a very large grain of salt. Yes, understanding that this is the story that has been developed and told over generations in order to justify the way that things are.
Yeah.
There is a certain amount of which that story becomes internalized and ingrained within the people of that culture and community to the point where they don't even necessarily think to question it. This is the way that things are. This is who we are. This is the way that things have been. And this is the way that they should be. And the idea that there are different ways that things could be done is, hello, this is why Shosara kind of got into trouble.
Yes.
There is a certain amount of purity and superiority that is inherent to the ancient elven cultures that all of this is founded upon. And along those lines, the history tells pretty quickly, oh, by the way, it's Shosara's fault that that Queen Dahlia was killed.
Yes.
That if Shosara hadn't been heretics, Dahlia would not have
happened.
needed to leave the wood and expose herself to the threat of the dragon.
Yes.
So it's Shosara's fault,
Blame
but
them.
we'll talk about that another time.
Exactly. We'll just kind of...
It's their fault. That we just want to make that clear. It's Shosara's fault.
Yes. Believe us, no matter what they tell you. We are to be believed. So after the whole Alamaze killing Queen Dahlia thing, which they completely skipped over in a heartbeat, in like one sentence or so, which is just fine, because there's a whole other book for that, High Steward Harwin created a contest to reseat the Rose Throne in Wyrm Wood. And he created the Contest of Love, otherwise known as the Cariad Castald. And Phyla won and made a pilgrimage to Oakhart and therefore ascended the Rose Throne, getting, of course, the blessing from Oakhart.
Right. The idea was that Dahlia was killed.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike previous transitions where the ruler vanishes into Oakhart, but after naming a successor or whatever, Dahlia is killed without naming a successor.
Yes.
And so now there is this power vacuum, and the question becomes, well, who is the one that is worthy to sit on the throne? We don't get into the details in these books, but there were presumably like multiple candidates that were leaders of high-placed women in the various high-ranking ranelles, both within Wyrm Wood and, as we learn here, in
Sereatha,
the Western Kingdoms. Mm-hmm. And so it's, well, how do we determine who we send as our representative? Well, let's have this contest.
Yeah.
This is who we will send. And, oh, look, our candidate that we selected through this, I'm sure, perfectly fair and equitable contest.
It sounds like you distrust elves there, Josh.
Well, it's not that I distrust elves. Well, I don't distrust elves as a whole.
Yes.
I do distrust the powerful elves because, remember, I am sort of operating under the assumption that Phyla and Aletia are the same person.
Yes.
And so if Phyla is the one that is sent to be like, and thus I am selected, it was Aletia, and there was some absolute skullduggery of some sort going on to determine that she was the one that would be selected to go. And possibly even like, oh, hey, here is my opportunity to return to the wood yet again, perhaps to be queen.
Yeah.
Or at least to be back into a position of power more publicly than I might have been in the past. Our candidate was the one selected by Oakhart. Again, you've got to take everything in like Elven history with a little bit of a critical eye.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you understand kind of what's going on beneath the surface level, there's a lot of stuff that just makes you go, I don't know. That seems a little hinky to me in some sense.
A little sketchy.
But Sereatha can then, the Western Kingdoms can then proclaim, look, the new queen comes from our lands.
Yes.
Obviously, this is an indication that we are
chosen,
blessed or chosen or important in some capacity, that Oakhart has chosen someone from our lands as the new queen of Elvendom.
And thus it was ordained.
Reinforcing that narrative that the culture has built up.
Yeah.
You know, that they have built everything around up to that point.
Agreed. So we're going to get to your favorite garbage person here in just a minute or so. So we'll get there. She's involved in this, and I know you know that. So Sereatha at this point did adopt consortus, the idea of the consortus in the court, and again had 5 and made one the High Steward, and one from each of the founding ranelles, one the head of the Crimson Spire, and one the champion of the Contest of Love. So Sereatha at this point chose the champion of the Contest of Love. That was the whole thing. That's where this one came from. So this now involves
an interesting bit of detail as well. They're talking about Phyla winning the Contest of Love.
Yes.
Phyla, a maiden whose kingdom had been lost to war, she doesn't even really have a past.
Such a nice myth.
Yeah.
She came from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Like Queens of Old is not from some high family. She just epitomizes what it truly means to be an elf. And again, demonstration of how even the lowest immortal elf queen high poobah of forever, can rise from her humble beginnings to become queen of elvendom.
Exactly.
There is enough BS, there's enough bullshit in the stories that are going on around here.
Yes.
To like fertilize all of the Surfos jungle.
To just fertilize the wastes.
To like remake the wastes.
Yes.
Make them
Prime
blossom
farmland.
again.
Prime farmland.
There's all sorts of
Oh, yeah.
nonsense that is being spun here.
So page 154 has the rise and fall of Alachia in all this. She kept winning since now Phyla is on the throne. Apparently, Alachia just kept winning the annual contest of love, but declined the role of consortess in Sereatha. And then finally, Phyla disappeared, and Alachia ascended the Rose Throne at that point. And so it's supposedly these two existed at the same time, just in different areas and different regions of the world. And then finally, Phyla disappeared, and since Alachia just had kept winning, oh, fine, now I'll take the throne. Now that she's gone, I guess I have to.
It was more that after Phyla stepped down and Liara, I'm getting the names right, Liara took the throne, and Liara was awful. Liara was so bad, it made everybody go, Phyla wasn't actually that bad.
Yes.
And wasn't queen for very long before she was kind of forced to step down, and Alachia took it. And again, going back to my theory about what may very well have been going on, was that Alachia was there as Phyla, was not happy that people were not happy with her.
Yes.
And stepped down and like, well, let's show you what you can really get, and got Liara on the throne to really cause problems so that when she came back and was her same self, essentially, people were like, oh, well, she's so much better than that awful person that we had before, despite being her own particular flavor of awful.
Yes.
But yeah, the whole story of Alachia was like, she kept going back every year to win the competition, was like, no, I am much more valuable in the court of Wyrm Wood, where she would basically be keeping an eye on everything, than I would be serving you, being here on the consortis, until, of course, then, oh, well, gee, I happen to be in the right place at the right time to ascend the throne. And once again, be queen of all elves, because my ego just don't quit.
Yeah, and all the false humility that Alachia could probably muster at the time. So, yeah, all of that is the politics aside. Eventually, the Scourge showed up, because all this is like pre-Scourge.
Yeah, and one of the other things that's kind of going on with this is that against the background of this queenie thing that's going on from Phyla to Liara to Alachia, you've got the Orichalcum Wars, you've got the resource rush to gain the resources and build the cares and protections that are going to be required for the Scourge, because we know this is coming. The Western kingdoms as a whole were all kind of like squabbling with each other, like they were not particularly unified.
Yeah.
Because of that complex web of alliances.
Yeah.
It's like Europe in the late 1800s. There are so many alliances and
treaties and bargains.
Treaties and relationships and everything like that that's going on. It doesn't take much for things to spark wars. That's kind of what was going on. The Gwydenro, the Western kingdoms as a whole.
Yes.
The individual kingdoms were all kind of like secret stuff against each other, and then like openly warring and fighting over resources and so forth. So suffering a lot more than Shosara did, where Shosara was very, oh, we're all going to pull together and work together because we know that by doing that we can succeed.
Yeah.
Getting Alachia onto the throne, kind of like, oh, but the Western kingdoms, we've got one of our people on the throne again. Things are kind of settling down. Oh, we really need to actually like prepare for the Scourge now.
Exactly.
So that was like all going on in the background of all of this, and it's not really described a whole lot in the history here, but that's an important aspect of it.
Yes.
Another important aspect of it, many of the kingdoms, the southern region of the Western kingdoms, were a big area known as the Rohaline Wood.
Yeah.
Again, because elves and woodlands are like peanut butter and chocolate, there were a lot of kingdoms that were in this area and used it for resources and things like that.
Yeah. And so
that comes into play importantly here in the not too distant future.
Absolutely, because the Scourge was approaching, and of course everyone's waiting to see what Wyrm Wood was going to do, because they're like, well, do we accept the rights of protection and passage from the Therans, or do we not? And since there was no word out of the Wyrm Wood until late, and Alachia did what Alachia did for Wyrm Wood, and we all know that story, Sereatha therefore built cares underground with Wyrm Wood's instruction, but those rights were kind of incomplete. They still held throughout the Scourge, but they weren't perfect. And
yeah, what ended up happening is that an incomplete copy of the rights of protection and passage, the Theran rights, got into the hands of the Sereathan court.
Yeah.
And while it wasn't complete, it gave them enough that Thera could not leverage their learning the way that they were to other places.
Yes.
Well, we've got some of this information, and because we didn't buy it from the Therans, it's okay for us to use this.
Yes.
And a lot of all their communities were like, well, horrors are starting to show up. Things are going bad. We haven't heard anything from the Queen. We're going to do what we can to protect ourselves.
Yes.
Because fear and survival will cause one to toss away traditions and beliefs pretty readily when the rubber meets the road.
Desperate times, desperate measures thing. And so
we can't wait. We've got to do this, and then set about kingdoms building individual cares and citadels, and then as well, Sereatha building basically a massive underground complex below the towers, abandoning them all and closing them up, hoping that when the Scourge was over, they could return and reopen them.
Yeah. Which, like we said at the beginning of the show, Sereatha didn't exactly fare well. They suffered greatly. So the Cariad Kestald contest, the contest of love, continued in the care because, of course, you have to provide hope for your people. And so an annual contest is not exactly a bad way to do it. People look forward to these things. And Maldwyn set to explore the possible ending of the Scourge and took with them 12 who sailed before the Scourge and 12 apprentice sailors so they could learn along the way. And Maldwyn was, I think, the winner of the last Cariad Kestald before they opened the doors. Maldwyn returned 200 days later and was soon named High Steward. He didn't return with all 24 hands on the crew, returned with 20 less of those hands on that crew. So sacrifices were made. But determined that it was well enough outside because, of course, there are indications inside, like everybody else during the Scourge, the elemental clock kind of stopped. So they had to take a guess. Maldwyn went out, returned, they opened the doors to the surface. So, of course, they still continued to beat back some of the horrors and claim the lands, and the city of Spires was completely in ruins. Less than 12 of the hundreds of spires were left. So, 2 of them that survived, of course, were the Crimson Spire and the Amethyst Spire.
The story of Sereatha's time during the Scourge is a little bit harrowing.
Yeah.
There was a lot of sounds that they could hear in their care of the destruction being wrought up above and tremors and other issues. The care did manage to survive, but emerged in one of the more dramatically changed geographies that we have actually kind of ever run into in the course of this, where the city previously had been at ground level.
Yeah.
Whatever destruction the horror or horrors that were focused on Sereatha wrought essentially carved out the land around the care so that it is now a plateau that the city is on top of. They excavated everything around the care, but were not able to actually break into it. And so it's a very dramatic change that has required some adaptation, in addition to the fact that a lot of the towers were ruined and destroyed and so forth over the course of the Scourge.
Well, and probably due to all of that 400 years of noises and anticipation and anxiety, the whole population, not that it says so in here, my personal feeling is that most of the population probably has some kind of PTSD from all that.
Yeah.
You're waiting for the next little thing to fall, and it doesn't happen. So that anxiety just builds for 400 years. That's just me.
Which makes their reaction to when they finally learned what happened to Wyrm Wood even more understandable to a certain extent.
Yes.
We narrowly avoided this fate that befell them.
Mm-hmm.
We need to carry on the traditions of elvendom that we have internalized as our societal narrative.
Yes.
Because Shosara are heretics, the Wormwood is corrupted, we are the last, we must carry on this tradition that we trace back before recorded time.
Yes.
In order to be this. And again, like playing into the idea of that while there may have been immortal elves that were involved in the founding and occasional guiding of these cultures, there are a lot of people involved, and you cannot ultimately control what a significant number of people do when they have been so steeped in a particular narrative and culture and belief system that you actually, like, imposed upon them.
Yes.
You know, it's like what happened with Thera. Like, yes, there are probably immortal elves still kind of behind the scenes in Thera to a certain extent, but Thera is so large that they can't really steer it anymore.
Yeah.
And a similar thing is probably going on with the Western Kingdoms.
Fair enough. So after they opened the doors and started to reclaim their lands and kind of rebuild Sereatha from the ground up and replace all the spires and things, Maldwyn he brokered a forgiveness with Shosara and tried to contact Wyrm Wood. They kept sending envoys down to Wyrm Wood. Well, on the 20th year, because 19 of those years, nobody came back. So it was still fraught with peril, and the horrors was probably still out there a little bit, getting the lands cleaned up. On the 20th year, they finally had one person come back from this envoy from Bloodwood, now Bloodwood, and learned of the changes that Alachia had wrought. You know, this is to what you just said a minute ago, not their favorite thing. Because, oh, look, the Shosarans were, bad. They're heretics, and Wyrm Wood was corrupted now, and so we're the last bastion. So Maldwyn now has to play peacemaker with the Bloodwood, Alachia, and the Therans, and Shosara. And so, rebuilding their entire civilization, they started trading with Thera and attempting to reconnect with the Bloodwood, but of course, Alachia's isolationist principles don't allow for that. And so they had, and of course they're trying to abandon Shosara, but still make peace with Shosara, but using them when they can't. I mean, it's a big, complicated mess.
Yeah. And the other important part of this is that while Sereatha itself kind of suffered during the Scourge, the Rohaline Wood, the southern region of the Western Kingdoms, where a lot of the kingdoms and cares had been built, was devastated. It is now a big part of the area that is known as the Wastes.
Yes.
And so there are a significant number of lost and forgotten cares and corruption and destruction and dangerous creatures. There's also the loss of all of that power that was part of that originally. And so you've got a people, you've got a nation, the Western Kingdoms, a culture broadly focused around Sereatha, with this narrative of having been tied closely to the seat of power to Wyrm Wood, because they've had at least Fela, then they had Alachia.
Yeah.
Both of whom came from the Western Kingdoms, were then seated on the Rose Throne, and this idea of the cultural stress and the heresy of Shosara, even though there has been some attempts of reconciliation post-Scourge because of what's happened to the Wood. And they're both realizing, well, this is kind of messed up now. How are we going to navigate this? The Western Kingdoms were a power and are now trying to find their new place in the world and rebuild their power while struggling with the narrative and the story of what has happened to now Bloodwood and how that relates to them and what it means to be an elf and all sorts of cultural background and baggage like that.
Agreed. And since, go for it.
It's like really, really, really interesting. I like really like it as a narrative.
Yeah.
How this is a kingdom that suffered for reasons that are not entirely clear. Some a lot suspect that it may have to do with the fact that they didn't have the full rights of protection and passage, that there would have been flaws in those that would have led to the easy breaching of the cares throughout the Rohaleen Wood.
Agreed.
And whatever resulted that ended up causing the effect that is going on to create the wastes and the ash and everything that's coming out of it.
Yeah. So in the most recent years, since doing the entire history of the Western Kingdoms, this is the most recent part. Maldwyn did a fine job, everyone believed, but right now, since the Therans are making a comeback and Shosara is doing what they're doing, and of course Bloodwood is Bloodwood, the consort has reasoned that Maldwyn isn't exactly the stern person that they need at the helm, and so they've replaced Maldwyn with Iolin, who is the Duke of the Crimson Spire. Remember, the Crimson Spire was founded by 100 soldiers from Wyrm Wood. So you all now have a soldier or a general in charge of Sereatha. And Iolin has vowed to find the gerryth beneath the wastes, all of them. He has also vowed to keep Sereatha free from foreign influence, just kind of an isolationist policy as well, and also praises the founding ranelles, because that's what you do when, of course, the Great Past is so good.
Yeah, there's a very strong orthodox belief structure in the face of tragedy and suffering and trauma that is the result of the Scourge.
Yeah.
The Scourge obviously causes all of this, but generally in the face of adversity, people tend to break one of two ways.
Yeah.
One is to hold on to their cultural beliefs even more strongly, to like double down,
close ranks,
and to kind of take the approach of all of this adversity and difficulty that we faced is because we were not pure enough. We were not walking the straight and narrow in the way, talking broadly culturally. And a lot of this can be dictated by the people that are in power. So like that's one avenue. Or the other is, okay, we have a new reality. We have a new environment, a new situation. We need to change and adapt to fit our new circumstances in order to continue to survive or thrive as a people. The Western Kingdoms, enough people in power did that kind of first thing where it's like, okay, the wood is corrupted. Shosara are heretics. We need to maintain the purity of elvish culture.
Yeah.
And they're not isolationist the way that the wood is.
No.
But they are still very like, we will tolerate other name givers within our lands, but we're not going to let them have any kind of power because we are an elven people. We are an elven land.
Yes. We must stay in charge.
Yeah, we're going to stay in charge. You know, we're not going to brook any kind of challenge to what we believe are our cultural foundations.
Yes, exactly.
It's not even necessarily that it's something that was made as a single concrete decision. It's something that is sort of the accumulated beliefs and culture that forms around a whole bunch of little decisions that are all made by certain people. Want to kind of draw a parallel here, right? And if none of this like seems familiar to you, like you don't get the references, that's fine. But I am an absolute fan of the Horizon video games, Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West. The world building for around the cultures in those is amazing.
Yes.
But I want to point out like specifically the Nora, which are the culture that you spend a lot of time with in the beginning of the very first game, because that's where the protagonist Aloy comes from. She comes from Nora lands, and the belief structures and the culture that has developed around the story that they have that has developed in the past about All Mother Mountain. She's sort of the goddess figure of the Nora. It's the sacred land, and those outside of the sacred land, those not within sight of Mother Mountain, are in benighted, dark lands, and that is why they are fallen and why they are decadent and corrupt and so forth, because they are not in sight of the purity that we believe in as a result of where we are and the cultural narrative that we have built up around that. It's a similar kind of thing in that the Western kingdoms, the Gwydenro, are like, we need to maintain this thing that was us, that has been such a large part of our cultural identity for centuries and centuries. Mm-hmm. We cannot get rid of that because we are the only ones left that have it.
Yes.
Shosara, they've been heretics for a long time. They're still elves, but only barely, maybe.
Yeah.
They're heretics. They let humans have equal power to them. What kind of nonsense is that?
Exactly.
The wood has been corrupted, as much as it was the seat and bright shining star at the heart of elven culture. It has now been corrupted. It can no longer be trusted to remain what it was before, and so therefore it falls to us to continue that tradition and to maintain it. Yes. And that is sort of the belief, the core cultural belief that lies at the heart of the present day Western kingdoms.
Agreed. So that brings us pretty much to present day. So that's the entire foundation of the Western kingdoms. I love the essay. I love where they were able to fit in between Shosara and Bloodwood and still have their own identity. And what happened to them was different than everybody else's care experience and Scourge experience. So well done all around.
It all feels like it fits very nicely in, expanding on the somewhat limited information that was in the original Bloodwood book.
Yeah.
Building connections and saying, okay, what if, and doing something that ties into those but has its own unique spin and does a really good job of setting up like this three-sided power struggle between the Wood and Aletia in particular, who wants to maintain her grip as the peak of elfendom, but had to make some very tough choices in order to survive and is not willing to admit that they have caused some problems because of her ego.
Yeah.
You've got Shosara, we've talked about them as they have found the strength and the value in accommodation and adaptation and welcoming other ideas into their culture in order to thrive and succeed. Like, again, that sort of second side, that face of adversity. This is the world that we live in. This is the environment that we live in. How can we adapt to that? And then you've got the Western kingdoms, which are holding on to this orthodox idea of elvendom, but are weakened as a result of the troubles and trauma that they suffered during the Scourge.
Yeah.
Again, really nice dynamics. And if you want to have a sort of epic conflict of kingdoms kind of thing around the elves, you've got a really great dynamic here. And we're going to go more into the Western kingdoms and the various powers and so forth there.
Yeah. The ranelles and whatnot.
You can still, because of the wastes and whatnot, much like you can with a Barsavian campaign, have it be like an exploration into destroyed lands and forgotten cares and all of the weird stuff that can come about as a result of that.
Yeah.
It's not all politics and stuff.
No, this is, again, it would make a great boxed set if Fossa were still doing boxed sets. So,
anyway,
I dig it all. So
it's great.
Yeah, no, I'm enjoying Elven Nations. I really am. It's a nice new sandbox playground to go delve into and come out of if you want to. So, we will be digging more into the Western Kingdoms and their ranelles and so forth as we go on in this little series. So, any final thoughts?
No. I've actually said quite a bit more than I thought I was going to about this.
Well, we hit your favorite garbage person, so the floodgates were open. So until next time, folks, go win your own Cariad Castald for your legend.
Good night, everybody.